I think we worked on this from, from when I had started, so probably like 6 months, until we were like, ready to go to the, or 5 months until we're ready to go to the e-staff. I already started, starting some of the solutions, like, reaching out to vendors, having demos, and
Yeah.
doing a lot of background running so I could see what was possible. But,
Yes.
but yes, I mean, months of planning, really wanting to be, buttoned up when we're going to the exec staff to ask
Yeah.
for a lot of money and then also the investment from our other peers across the people team.
Welcome to the WorkOps Podcast. In every episode, we dig into one story, a process that went sideways, a system that just didn't work, and what someone actually did about it. It's packed with practical lessons that you'll want to bring straight back to your team. This podcast is brought to you by Kinfolk, the AI service desk built for HR. I'm your host, Jeet, and with that, let's dive in. Hey, everybody. Today, I'm joined by Weston Fillman, who's the Director of People Operations at 1Password. Wes, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we jump into things, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you chose HR?
Yeah. Well, hi, Jeet. Thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So I am relatively new at 1Password. I'm the Director of People Operations and Employee Relations, and I've been here since January. But my career in like people operations and HR is honestly not a straight line. After college, I went to a liberal arts school. I went to graduate school for higher education. I always thought I would work in college admissions and did that a bit as a graduate intern. But after grad school, I actually did Teach for America and I taught kindergarten in Baltimore. And that really experience kind of shaped how I learned quickly, how to meet people, what talent and opportunity really mean. And, how I learned a lot about managing people, managing a group of kindergartners. But I took my first job in the people space while still inside TFA on their recruiting team. So did that for a bit. And then I got recruited by Google to join the talent acquisition function there. I eventually pivoted into a people programs manager role where I focused a lot on operational excellence in our talent function and on diversity programs for tech staffing and for Google Cloud while it was going through a period of rapid growth. And that's where I kind of got this interest in building systems, versus kind of the core TA piece. And then after that, I moved into business partnering and employee engagement at Facebook and Zendesk, and my scope kept on growing. And before I was here at 1Password, I took a HR director role at Juniper Networks, where I led a lot of HR transformation type projects and employee engagement projects. So I've always really liked, kind of looking at systems and systems change for organizations and how we do our people processes and making sure that they work for everyone.
Nice. There's a definite thread there of wanting to help people do their best and helping them grow, whether that's always from college admissions to Teach for America kindergarten, and then all the way through. What a career you had so far already with all the different logos that you've racked up.
Yeah, if you asked me like 15 years ago, like this is what I would be doing, I would have probably thought you were crazy.
Yeah, no, it's a great combination. You've got kind of the real Venn diagram of the people stuff as well as the systems thinking, and it feels like you really landed in a really great role at 1Password since the beginning of this year, which I'm sure feels like it's gone very, very quick already. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about the story that we're going to talk about, starting with what kind of company were you working for where this particular dysfunctional HR process or system was in place?
Yeah. So I joined a large enterprise tech company, over 10,000 employees. And one of the first things that I inherited was the results of an internal hiring audit, as well as the results of a series of focus groups we were doing with employees on their, experience at the organization, on people and culture, and on how our people processes worked. And one of the consistent themes that, that was present were that in systems like talent acquisition, in the way that we did like compensation equity, in things like our job family architecture, that there was inconsistency, that things were unstructured or process and tools were outdated. Nobody built things with bad intentions, but the company had grown a lot, particularly in the 5 years probably prior to me joining. But we hadn't made a lot of longer term strategic investments in, the tools and systems, that were guiding both the people's teams work, but also the employee experience, that was aligned to that.
Yeah, I got it. It sounds like that classic example of the systems and the processes and the tools haven't quite caught up with the growth that the company experienced, and
Yeah.
then you were brought in to be like, hey, come and fix it.
Yeah. So one example of that was, within talent acquisition, like every function was kind of running their own version of the hiring process. Like there was some standardization, but some teams had structured interview panels. Others were having conversational kind of interviews, like without rubrics or without, behavioral type questions. This kind of hiring, like was, leading to, issues, around equity and experience and, really limiting, the types of candidates we were bringing in. you know,
Yeah.
One of the other things that, like, by doing an audit, telling us about this broken hiring process was that, we need to like fix this problem from a systemic approach. And we need to think about the tools that we're using as well. At the time, they're using a legacy ATS that I will not, but, it was causing a lot of problems in just the workflow and just that our recruiters had, the workflow experience that our hiring managers had. One of the first things, that I did in working with my partners in talent acquisition was go out into the field and, look at what tools are available. Couldn't get rid of the ATS, but we, could put a bolt-on system on top of it. And really, this was a couple of years ago, and we're certainly in a different AI space today than we were then,
Yes.
but we're still, some still new AI driven tools that we could use to improve our sourcing ability, improve the workflow, and also improve like our ability to match, candidates that are good fits for roles. And really we're, wanted to kind of be a little bit on the forefront of bringing some of those tools into our system. The other thing, what we looked at was creating structure and process and creating a hiring process redesign really from end to end, adding in new steps, like in pre-briefs and debriefs, creating structured interview guides that align to company values, and then also creating standardization across every business unit and in how, how the hiring process should run. And then ultimately facilitating, training for, hundreds or thousands of hiring managers and then ultimately like thousands of interviewers across the organization. So really taking that systems level approach, like this hiring process was driving us on the people team crazy. It was driving hiring manager crazy. It was, leading to poor outcomes, lack of diversity in hiring, as well. By focusing on the structural shift there, we were able to improve the efficacy and time to hire, but also improve the quality of hire as well. One
Yeah.
thing, too, that I should mention is in this broader project of kind of transformation on our people processes, it really quickly showed us how many things are interconnected because so we were working, one of the first things we kicked off was this process redesign for talent acquisition, but very quickly it, also showed some of the holes that we had in having an outdated job family architecture. So it's like you can build a new house, but like you walk inside and then the floor plan's wrong or like there's no foundation. So in part of this work and, in my role in looking over, kind of as the overseer of these, different projects was to be able to see the interconnected dependencies on, we need a strong job family architecture because that leads to quality in hiring. That leads to our ability to do better performance management. And then that also connects to how we have greater equity and total rewards. And so, yeah, I can pause there, but I'm happy to share a little. I don't want to ramble on too much. But
No, I love that. I just wanted to keep you going. There are
yeah,
so many threads in there and so many questions that
yeah,
come to mind off the back of that. And it's really interesting what you said initially that, hey, you went out to look for tools in the market, but actually when you dug into a little bit more, it sounds like a really interconnected system of solutions that you have to fix. And you're kind of behaving like a product manager of like, once you start
yeah.
putting a thread, you're like, hey, actually, this is connecting to that thing. And where did you start? Because it sounds like, yes, you went to look for tools, but actually there
Yeah,
was a bit of discovery going on. What did that
yeah,
process look like to really unearth, okay, we got to fix something here?
yeah. I think that how it started was looking at the employee lifecycle and looking at all of those touch points, like in our systems and our process, and creating really a structured, plan that we got executive buy-in for. So identifying this is the problem we're seeing where we're bringing in employees. This is the problem we're seeing on our tooling front. This is the problem we're seeing on some things like our job leveling and frameworks. And this is what we're seeing, when it comes to like performance. And so really identifying each of the core problems, proposing a solution And then at the time, or, CTRO, took this to the executive staff and got their buy-in. And one of the things that we ensured was that our executives were all on board with these changes and also willing to support them. We asked for quite a bit of money. We didn't get all of the money that we wanted, but we got a lot more than we might have expected. And really pointing also like what the risk areas are if we don't solve these. Because, a lot of them, could lead to issues of like fairness and leveling or equity in pay. Pay equity was part of this, as well. So really the first step was like creating a large, vision of how this will drive like systems level change, for our people processes and the impact on employees. We also had some work streams focused on people and culture too. And that one of my peers owned that, kind of process. So looking at things like allyship and training and learning and development, because we can fix the tools, and create better people processes for all employees. But we also have to make sure that we're investing in like the culture of the organization if you want to drive, large scale transformation or change.
Yeah. There's so much background work even before you bring in a tool, right? That needs to be done.
Oh, I think we worked on this from, from when I had started. So probably like 6 months, until we were like, ready to go to the, or 5 months until we're ready to go to the e-staff. I already started some of the solutions, like, reaching out to vendors, having demos, like doing a lot of background learning so I could see what was possible.
Yes.
But yes, I mean, months of planning, really wanting to be, buttoned up when we're going to the exec staff to ask for a lot of money. And then also the investment from our other peers across the people team, because I'm not was not the head of total rewards or the head of compensation or, the head of talent acquisition. I'm in another role, director role over here. But I, need you to be bought into these changes as well. So that socialization, among like the HR leadership team and peers is really, really important to have business buy-in from our other peers across the HR function as well.
That's huge. It's really great to see you kind of took a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach at the same time, and kind of a sideways socialization approach at the same time. And it feels like if those things weren't going at the same time, it wouldn't have really been successful.
Absolutely, because we could get buy-in, from execs, but if people did prioritize this work, that it's important because of the day-to-day employee lifecycle programs that need to run, right? Or the compensation cycle that's upcoming. So to be really strategic about when we also were looking at doing implementation of these things. So we're going to implement an AI, driven software tool for pay equity. Well, it's like, needs to be around our reporting, requirements, but it also can't happen during, the annual compensation planning time. So I really learned a lot about playing outside of my lane and also moving in and learning with other teams as well. So that way I could, help drive this work and hold them accountable and really kind of lead even when I didn't have authority, in some of their statements too.
That's fascinating. And some of the things that you're talking about here, from what we're hearing, still carries through today to when you're bringing in AI solutions or agentic solutions. And it feels like they've just been 10x'd in some ways, and in some things have changed. What have you seen change, or what is still holding true and is not different at all, whether it was pre-AI or post-AI now?
Yeah. Interesting question. I think what's holding true is the necessity for the judgment of people in human resources, right? Like, I think that's the one thing that's absolutely holding true. We need to keep, at the top. I think the other thing, is the importance of like trust and accountability and transparency. The AI tools we were looking at a couple of years ago are very different than the agentic solutions, that I've seen today, and that I've demoed today, and that, my team is looking into now at 1Password. But I think it's, one thing that was true even a couple of years ago was this fear of, is this, AI tool that we're using for talent acquisition going to suggest a decision that's wrong? And really, we really have to, is we're using tools or exploring tools or building tools now, with being able to build our own agents, that we're really trying to break them. We're really, ensuring that they're not leading us in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing that I've definitely seen that's true today.
Yeah.
I think what's different in 2026 is that now that we have the ability, we just rolled this out at 1Password yesterday, the ability for everyone to build their own agents. We really need now to think about giving people the time and space to learn and to like upskill themselves. And we really really need to model that as leaders. I just shared that with my HR leadership team about an hour ago. So certainly something top of mind, but we also need to, clear space for our teams to experiment and try, and then help them, envision, what their roles can look like. And I've seen some examples on my team of the folks that have dove head first, how they've saved themselves time by automating some of their work, but they're not working themselves out of a job. They're, like one of our onboarding program manager has freed up time for him to spend time on creating new content for onboarding, keeping it up to date, building out, thinking about creating new videos and new engagement points in a remote company. So I think that's what we have to keep. We have to keep the human element in it. I think that's just something that we really need to be intentional about. And that's how people can reimagine, their roles look like.
How much more complex do you think with AI agents coming into the fore? How much more complex has the influencing and the top-down research and the bottom-up research and the sideways socializing, has that process, when you're thinking about, we can talk about build versus buy or build and buy soon, but has that become more complex, or do you think it's becoming easier to bring in AI native solutions versus 2 years ago when you had to do all of that influencing to bring in a tool?
I think it's way easier to bring an AI native solution.
Okay.
I think it definitely is, because we know it's here and we know it's not going anywhere. And, I, San Francisco, I walk my dogs and a million, AI ads on the bus stop, on the bus, on the highway. It's here, right? Like the pendulum, I think will swing, it's swinging hard one way right now. I think it might swing back a little bit at some point, but so we don't have to do as much of the, that influencing to like make a decision to get an AI native solution. What I think is different is we know that we're better at asking the questions and knowing, what questions we need to ask. And I think, my company, as well as many companies, have spun up, working committees like on AI, working committees like software rationalization, like making sure that we're all looking at things in the same way. In previous organizations, we weren't, I was working with privacy, legal, and we weren't sure like how our data was being used to train AI models of some of the tools, that, we were going through like privacy and security, processes and procurement. Like, so I think we've gotten a lot better at that. So it's easier to get the buy. And I think the question right now is that build buy question. And that's where it's like, we're not sure, do we want to spend money on something or do we want to try and, build on our own? So I think that's where the question is sitting, at least from my perspective. And as I've talked to a lot of my peers in the space, we don't, but we also want to move quickly. We don't want, like, I can't transform the HR operations role if we don't have better tools. So I, think is, can we move quickly, on changing this, so that way we can, we can change the roles and change the work that people are able to do and spend time doing more higher value things. So we are a little bit of a chicken and I think in many companies, but I think as we see success with building agents and what that looks like, that'll make us more confident that we can bring in agentic solutions from the outside,
Exactly.
That will like,
Exactly. Unless you start to kind of test things internally, then you don't really know the limits of where you can take it versus where you have to bring in a solution. And what we're seeing is that people are like, should we build or buy? And naturally where they land is it's probably going to be a build and buy solution, depending on what you're trying to solve. And then the factor becomes, hey, how quickly can we move? To your point, speed is becoming one of those decision-making factors of which path we choose. Or you kind of see that played out as well, or are there kind of other things that you see weigh into your decisions?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head with the build and buy, notion. I think that's where, I feel like a lot of companies are landing. That's like what I see come up a lot of, my work is like, we can build things, we want to build things, or at least my vision is I want to build things that are for like personal productivity. But I think if we want like widespread adoption of tools as like a source of truth, they need to be really, really good. We want to be looking at like say like, agentic chatbots, like for HR or, a solution for onboarding. We really want to have a strong employee experience so we can drive behavior change of of our people managers or of our
Yeah.
individuals. I always joke some of our Slack channels turn into HR question spaces. So we need to change that behavior. Right? So like, if I build them a tool that's not so great, then
Yes,
that won't behavior change. So, we want
exactly.
to, I don't know where we'll land
Mhm.
in that discussion, but I do
Yeah.
think it's really interesting to me.
Yeah. Totally. And, we're seeing a lot of companies, including ourselves, and we're really leaning into quad cowork, for example. And that's for personal productivity. But when we're thinking about something that's collaborative and reaching our employees where they are and helping us to work together in a proper system that also gives us the data and is protected, then suddenly it's like, okay, now we need to think a little bit differently. And it feels like every company is going to need to embrace the mess. And it is going to be messy right now because there's going to be a lot of experimentation and there's going to be a lot of like, is it this tool? Is it that tool? Do we build? Do we buy? How are you navigating that mess? Because it's a lot to take in for a team, like a people team who's not only doing their day job and a lot of the human side of things as well, but now they suddenly have to think about how do we think about bringing a tool in or building stuff ourselves, which is again going to require upskilling from their side.
Yeah, I think we're at early stages, of looking at tools and things like that. But I think we got really focusing on having cross-functional teams, kind of doing this. So like
Mm,
combination of, our HR and, tech partners, on tech delivery, and then folks from like the people operations team and making sure that we're all communicating in that way and that we're looking at tools together and, so we're all kind of along for the journey. I think that's, what's been working for us in kind of navigating that. And we've also had, have some of our leaders involved with some AI guidelines and things like that. So that way we're pushing out like, a company framework, on AI. So I think that kind of thing, our chief people officer just did a podcast yesterday talking about that I
yeah.
can't wait to a little bit later. But that's, I think those kinds of things that are happening, in tandem, with creating the space for people to, build their own tools and get comfortable with
Mm,
tools. I think that's what will kind of ultimately drive the change and the choices that we make. Yeah,
love
I
it.
think building fluency is so important and getting people to try things, that to me shows them that they're capable, our teams are capable of really using a tool that we bring on externally to its fullest potential. Because I've
Yeah.
also seen from my past experience, like when we buy a tool, but we don't enable all of its capabilities or people are afraid to use it, we don't get the full value out of it as well. So I think that's important
Totally.
too.
So I have, again, so many more questions. I'm loving this discussion. One potentially spicy question I have for you is you mentioned earlier that, yeah, we want to free up the HR operation manager's time to be able to focus on more of the higher value work. So it sounds
Mhm.
like you're in the camp of actually, and maybe this is because you're in the Bay Area, but it sounds like you're in the camp of AI is not going to take our jobs. And that is a bit of a myth. And actually, if anything, it's going to increase our capacity. Did I read that right? Or where do you
No,
stand on that?
I mean, that's definitely where I am, personally, in the camp. I'm not going to say that I don't think like AI will like never replace, some jobs. And I think there are companies that's the vision that they want, right? Like, but I feel like the place that I work at and like how we're talking about it and we're framing it is a lot on, creating that space for that higher value, work that requires judgment. And then personally, that's how I want to use AI. That's how I want my teams to use AI. And I'm seeing it, with the folks that have been these early adopters, and becoming these power users, and agent builders about how much they've already freed up from the operational workload of like scheduling emails, sending emails, writing emails to like every new
Okay.
hire, like, things like that. Like, so, and how they're able to change their work. I do think for some roles and what I've, in my, one-on-ones with, folks on my teams, has been talking about like what kind of things do you love spending your time on and how, as we free up operational work, what does that look like? You love compliance. Well, how can you take on more and more work because now you can do this at a higher level or you're working on, contractors and, bring contractors on,
Yeah.
does this role will pivot to you're like a contract program manager because you've automated the operational point of onboarding contractors. So now you can spend more time on that extended like workforce management or
Exactly.
Can tell operations teams, someday, they can actually spend more time fielding employee policy questions that
Mm,
need judgment or, do exit interviews or the other things that we can shift the role of the business partner and shift the role of operations, as we scale, it can grow and that kind of thing. So I think as we build more agents too, operationalize some of these workflows, it'll create new opportunities to build, to be more of a builder of HR agents or HR process. So I think we just have to be open-minded about how our world changes, that it's not going to,
mm,
a lot of our work, especially in people ops is going to shift, but that doesn't mean like it goes away. So, I would
totally.
never replace, a person with a robot, fully, because there's so much
Exactly.
judgment and nuance required, in anything that's related to people.
Exactly. And it's interesting. Some of the examples you gave there is, I bet none of the folks that signed up for the role signed up to do the repetitive stuff that
Right.
can be automated. They want to focus on the higher level strategic stuff. And that's what's on their job
Yeah.
description. So you're being more outcomes focused. And it's like, let's get rid of the stuff that's repetitive and let's let you focus on delivering those outcomes at a much higher
Yes, and
speed.
like you're focused on what kind of impact you could have in your role in driving the business.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge opportunity, for, I don't think like a people operations type role needs to, become like a HR business partner type role, but how can we be able to automate some of the things so that we can be like much more closely aligned and be able to, to both drive value, for our
Yeah.
organization.
Love it. So
Yeah.
let's bring us back to the beginning of the conversation where you
Yeah.
mentioned some of the dysfunctional hiring processes. Now that we are in the age of agentic AI, how would you go about it differently today if you were to solve some of those challenges and if you were to influence internally? Or would it be different at all?
I think now, because we're like in this age of AI, I think we can do some things better when it comes to like auditing our systems, or
Mm,
people's systems, like not just like a one-time like snapshot of when something's broken and we need to fix. I think because we can automate process a lot easier now and like have better access to data and data analysis, like, we can audit like what I'm seeing like our teams do for analyzing data, whether it's our business partners or our team leaders, like they're able to, with AI to have so much more rich data in an easy way, that's very different than, a number of years ago and how much time it took people analytics to kind of do some of that stuff for us. So I think
yeah.
the way I view it differently now is that like, because we can do some of this stuff faster on a more regular basis, we can like see when processes are failing, much sooner. So that, and I just think
Mm,
that that would really, how it would change how I do this, that kind of transformation work today. You know,
I love that.
yeah, I think the
Sure.
biggest thing differently is focusing on the data piece and, building that regular cadence of understanding how our systems are working. And that makes it so much easier for us to do data analysis on a regular basis, without, the need of deep analytics expertise. We have to always
Yeah.
check it. Why we have people analytics partners, but we're able to, to understand where our systems are falling apart or where our process isn't working, whether it be hiring, whether it be performance. So I think that would just change how we do this because we're able to do a lot more, ourselves and be able to make some of these tweaks. It doesn't require always looking at things just, a couple times a year because of the
Yeah.
complexity of being able to, to get information and get data. I think the other thing I might do differently, would be look more at, framing this as like a infrastructure and it's an infrastructure problem, that we have and making
Mm,
sure that like leaders and executives understand like how important the systems that our people function is like built on, just how important they are. And I both mean systems from a tooling perspective, but also the frameworks and things that we follow. Like, if we don't build like, if we don't have a really strong job family architecture, or we don't have a really strong, performance foundation. We didn't have, one of the things I'd worked on was like talent development plans and planning. Like if we don't
mm,
have these ironed out, they can create so much inequity over time. They lead to attrition. They lead to us, not being able to do like talent assessment interview as effectively as we could. I just think that they slow down organizations. So, I think one of the things I would do again, in this process is frame this less as like something that's like upsetting to employees or is driving employee engagement down, but something that's like just that's critical to the business and being able to show,
Right.
that. And I think I've gotten a lot better at that. It's like, how do we show the business impact of people process? And so that's certainly something
Yeah.
I would on that framing. And I've learned a lot, that shifting kind of roles and that growth. Yeah.
Yeah. There's so much there. Thank you, Wes. The need to be closer to business impact now more than ever. I love that
Absolutely.
you kind of inferred that you're democratizing access to data, and therefore we go back to your point around speed is one of the biggest things that we now need to factor in. It's like, hey, there's no need to wait anymore, and we can be more proactive about being able to act on things that are about to break or just broken, as opposed to having to wait to find out more detail about those
Right.
kind of things until it's too late. So that's awesome. I'm sure there are some folks that are listening in who are thinking, this is all amazing. It sounds like Wes has got a lot of support, but where do I start? As a final question, what advice would you give to someone who's kind of jumping into some of these processes or evaluating what to do next in this age of AI?
I would say the first thing you should do, is think about your own workflow. Like think about how you spend your time. I think and also like reflect what do you think about like, what are you really good at and what are you struggle with? So like, in my own like AI journey in like thinking about work and thinking about process, like I've focused on the things that I'm not as strong at and trying to figure out how I can leverage AI to help me with those things. Like I often agree to doing a lot of things at work. Yes, yes, yes. And I've learned the power of no over the years that, when I'm excited about something and, it's like I want to take on more and, want to have more influence. So yes, of course I want to do more. But the risk is I'm not like a bit in a project manager or program manager, type role, but it's not always my core strength or managing all of the asks and commitments I've had. So I've, focused initially on using AI to help me build like an agent to help keep on top of my day, like what I've committed to and holding me accountable. So like building my own like mini chief of staff, if you will. So I think I think about the things that where you need help with, then try to use AI, to solve the problem, those problems. Or if there's gaps in your experience, what are the things that you need to know more about, or that you're less familiar with? I work at a global company. I don't know every, Canadian, historically based in Toronto, and I don't know everything about every province, right? So like using AI to help me, learn when I have a gap, things like that. I think that's what helps start you on your journey. And that's what's allowed me to see what's possible.
Mhm.
And that's changed my mindset when I'm looking at our people systems and looking at, our larger processes around, how AI can actually change them fully. So yeah, maybe that's my little to
That's very cool. I think people are going to start flooding your inbox to learn more about this chief of staff that you're building out for yourself. Where can people find you, Wes?
you can find me on LinkedIn, Weston Fillman.
Great.
Pretty easy to find. The only person with my name that I know. But yeah, my contact
Great.
information's on there. Yeah.
Amazing. Wes, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us and your thought process. It's been amazing to hear about your journey so far. And to everyone listening, I will catch you on the next one.
Well, thanks for having me. This is a great conversation.